In defiance of Soviet complacency, Cuban anti-aircraft guns fire on U.S. reconnaissance planes. With the crisis escalating, new hope of a diplomatic solution comes from an unlikely source. ABC reporter John Scully meets with a Soviet diplomat known as Alexander Fomin at the Occidental Restaurant in Washington, D.C., a block from the White House. His real name is Alexander Feklisov.
My position as a counselor was that of a cover because I was an intelligence officer, and moreover, I was the resident of the Russian intelligence group in Washington at that time.
Scully had talked with State Department officials and had been briefed on how to handle the conversation.
Coffee was served, and without any overtures he said, "On the authority of the highest American authority, I am proposing these terms of the Cuban crisis solution. First, the Soviet Union takes its missiles from Cuba and the U.S. removes its blockade. Second, the President gives a public pledge of non-aggression against Cuba." I said, "There's a question, what do you mean by highest authority of the United States?" And he said it letter by letter.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States.
In Moscow, Khrushchev composes a personal and emotional letter to Kennedy, appealing for an end to the crisis. He offers to remove the missiles in return for Kennedy's promise to end the quarantine and not invade Cuba. When the letter is finally received, decoded, and translated, it is after 9 p.m. on the 26th. 12 hours later at 9 a.m. on the 27th, ExComm reconvenes in the White House. While members are discussing the conciliatory Khrushchev letter, President Kennedy is handed a news bulletin and reads it aloud.
Premier Khrushchev told President Kennedy yesterday to withdraw offensive weapons from Cuba if the United States withdrew its rockets from Turkey. He did. Oh, it's read by both of the associations. Put it out so far. The Reuters said the same thing. He did. He didn't really say that, did he? He may not be putting out another paper.
ExComm thinks that Khrushchev, or some new hardline element in Moscow, is adding further demands. The removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
You know, to get those two different messages in close proximity, the question that was raised in the minds of not only myself, but a lot of other people, who's in charge in the Soviet Union? You know, and that's when things really get dangerous. You know, if there is some uncertainty about who's in command and who's giving the orders on the other side, that's when you know you're really in danger.
The danger is becoming very real, and for one man, it will be fatal. Ever since the Soviet missiles were first discovered, the U.S. Air Force has been flying periodic spy missions over Cuba. So far, the Soviets have hesitated to fire. 9 a.m. Major Rudolph Anderson takes off from McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando, Florida, for his overflight of Cuba. At 10 a.m. local time, he guides his U-2 over the Cuban port of Baines. Against standing orders from Moscow, the Soviet commander on the ground decides to fire. The missile streaks 75,000 feet into the sky and bursts next to Anderson's aircraft, killing him and sending the U-2 spinning down to Earth. The Cuban Missile Crisis now has its first combat fatality. Word of the shoot-down doesn't reach the president until a 4 p.m. meeting with ExComm.
U-2 was shot down. Low altitude, it was shot down. Yes, Roger said it was not shot down. Pilot killed? Well, this is much an escalation by them, isn't it?
A U.S. pilot has been killed, and the military want a response. Airstrikes preceding the invasion of Cuba are set to start tomorrow, unless Kennedy and Khrushchev can find a way out. In Washington, the president decides to send Bobby Kennedy to meet with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and make an offer. The Soviets would dismantle and immediately remove their missiles from Cuba. The U.S. would end the quarantine and promise not to invade Cuba. But the Kennedys secretly offer one more, very substantial incentive. The U.S. would also remove NATO Jupiter missiles from Turkey. But only if that concession were kept utterly secret by the Soviets. Kennedy gives the Soviets 24 hours to respond. With U.S. attacks on Cuba just hours away, the nuclear battlefield is as close as it has ever been. For those in the know, both in Washington and Moscow, fear has reached a fever pitch.
I told my wife, I will not go to work today. I don't know what will be tomorrow. It's quite possible that tomorrow we will not be alive. Let's go to the cinema to see a new film.
The Secret Service wanted to take the president to the underground. Well, I had been to the underground and I was cleared for it. That night was one of the most miserable that I've ever spent because I kept thinking of what could happen and, you know, that I would be in a safe place and my family would be incinerated because I was convinced that Washington would be a target.
The whole of mankind was on the brink, on the verge of a nuclear abyss. We were 2 hours away from the end. 2 hours.
October 28th, 3 a.m. Moscow. The Soviets have an announcement to make, a personal message from Khrushchev to President Kennedy. This time, they use Radio Moscow rather than a Western Union telegram. Khrushchev announces that the missile sites will be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. Is the crisis finally over? President Kennedy puts off military action for one day while he waits for that day's reconnaissance photography to be examined.
The planes are out, and when we look at the photography, now they're pulling back. You could see that they'd pulled the missiles back, they had pulled the launchers out. It was obvious now that they had gotten the word.
Over the following months, 60 ballistic missiles and 134 nuclear warheads are dismantled and shipped back to the Soviet Union. Although serious tensions remain, one of the most perilous chapters of the 20th century is over.
The United States has not been at DEFCON 2 since the Cuban Missile Crisis. After spending a few weeks at the brink of nuclear war, both the Americans and the Soviets took steps to make certain that superpower confrontation was never conducted in the dark, and that the other side always had a way out. Thank heaven for second chances. The Cuban Missile Crisis almost left us without one. I'm Tom Clancy. Thanks for watching.